Warnings about how much debt the United States is actually in typically are issued whenever the establishment in Washington starts plotting to try and cut benefits that will affect the quality of life of American citizens, a quality of life that is declining not by all metrics, but by many. And yet, typically, whenever those warnings are issued, whenever the preparations begin to tell Americans that they need to expect cuts to the few benefits that the government actually gives them, things that place them barely at sustenance level, including America's senior citizens, the argument is rolled out that while we're drowning in debt, somehow the hundreds of billions of dollars we spend on foreign wars, including the ongoing and seemingly endless war in Ukraine, is never mentioned. A classic in this genre came today from the New York Times editorial board, a newspaper that has cheered the war in Ukraine every step of the way, applauded while the Biden administration pours huge amounts of money into the arms industry and the CIA and the Pentagon to keep that war going. And yet today issued an editorial, the headline of which, quote, "America is living on borrowed money." And here's a bit of what the newspaper said, speaking as always for the establishment of Washington. Quote, "Borrowing is expensive. A mounting share of federal revenue, money that could be used for the benefit of the American people, goes right back out the door in the form of interest payments to investors who purchase government bonds." Now, let's just stop there for a second. They are acknowledging the core premise, which is that all the money that the United States spends on servicing its debt or building up that debt could instead be used, in the words of the paper, for the benefit of the American people. But instead, we're paying interest rates on bondholders. The paper goes on, quote, "Rather than collecting taxes from the wealthy, the government is paying the wealthy to borrow their money. By 2029, the government is on pace to spend more each year on interest than on national defense, according to the Congressional Budget Office. By 2033, interest payments will consume an amount equal to 3.6% of the nation's economic output. Before the pandemic, a decade of very low interest rates meant that even as the federal debt swelled, interest payments remained relatively modest. Measured as a share of the national economy, the federal debt was roughly twice as large at the beginning of 2020 as it was at the beginning of 1990, but the burden of interest payments was barely half as large. The era of low interest rates has ended, however. The cost of living on borrowed money is rising. It is imperative for the nation's leaders to chart a new course." So what is this new course now that we're saddled with unsustainable levels of debt? Is it that we should stop maintaining military bases all over the world that let us rule the world by superior military force? Is it that we should stop trying to change the governments of other countries and install governments that we like better? Is it that we should stop pouring hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars every year into the coffers of Raytheon and Boeing and General Dynamics and the CIA and the Pentagon in pursuit of these wars that we are constantly fighting, unlike any other country in the world, so that we can instead enjoy what was once called the peace dividend in the 1990s, the thing we were promised when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed that never actually came because immediately the security state, even in the 90s, found excuses to continue wars. They found a war in Haiti, they found a war in the Balkans, and then 9/11 happened and the next 20 years was spent on waging more warfare than ever. And finally, when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, the last major remnant of the war on terror, 6 months later, not even, regardless of whose fault it is, the United States government, the security state, and the arms industry which they serve found a brand new war, the one in Ukraine, that has been a gold mine for the arms industry at the expense of the American people. So when the New York Times says it's time to chart a new course, given the debt in which they're drowning, is that what they mean? No, that is not what they mean. They don't even mention any of the items I just referenced. Instead, they say, quote, "Both parties say they understand the need for larger changes." Quote, "We're going to do even more to reduce the deficit," President Biden declared in a speech from the Oval Office after Congress voted to raise the debt ceiling. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, acknowledging that the legislation didn't amount to much, said after the vote that he intended to form a bipartisan commission, quote, "so we can find the waste and we can make the real decisions to really take care of this debt." The paper says any substantive deal will eventually require a combination of increased revenue, meaning increased taxes, and reduced spending. Not least because any politically viable deal will require a combination of those options. Both parties will have to compromise. Republicans must accept the necessity of collecting what the government is owed and of imposing taxes on the wealthy. Democrats must recognize that changes to Social Security and Medicare, the major guarantors of a quality of life that's just minimally decent for people who work their entire lives and then become old and they're living longer and longer, the paper says we need changes to those programs because they are, quote, the major drivers of expected federal spending growth should be on the table. Anything less will prove fiscally unsustainable. That will require what the paper calls painful choices. Not painful for the owners of the New York Times nor its editors or reporters, painful for the vast majority of the American people who are living way below middle-class standards, whose quality of life has been steadily declining. The paper concludes the failure to make those choices also has a price, and the price tag is rapidly increasing. Here's a paper that has been cheering $100 billion authorized and counting on a war in Eastern Europe that is in a country that President Obama has long said is not a vital interest of the United States, that long was viewed by Washington policymakers as being nowhere valuable enough to be worth risking a war with Russia, and that is exactly what we are now doing. A year and a half into it, the United States is the primary sponsor of one side of this proxy war, and there's no mention of that at all, or any of the vast military spending. In this manifesto the New York Times issued today, warning people that the thing that keeps them eating and being able to have medical access in their old age needs to be cut because of how much debt the United States is. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, who is somebody we interviewed about a month ago, who is most certainly one of the world's most influential economists. He has guided countries out of their debt crises, including Bolivia and Poland, and then attempted to do so in Russia, and has become a vocal establishment critic after spending much of his life inside the establishment at Harvard and at the World Bank and other financial institutions, wrote an article in May of this year warning that there's no way to get out of this debt crisis unless we begin to cut spending on the U.S. war machine. This is what he wrote, quote, in the year 2000, the U.S. government debt was $3.5 trillion, equal to 35% of the gross domestic product. By 2022, the debt was $24 trillion, equal to 95% of the GDP. The U.S. debt is soaring, hence America's current debt crisis. Yet, both Republicans and Democrats are missing the solution. Not a solution, the solution. Quote, stopping America's wars of choice and slashing military outlays. Suppose the government's debt had remained at a modest 35% of GDP as in 2000. Today's debt would be $9 trillion, as opposed to $24 trillion. Why did the U.S. government incur the excess $15 trillion in debt? The single biggest answer is the U.S. government's addiction to war and military spending. According to the Watson Institute of Brown University, the cost of U.S. wars from fiscal year 2001 to fiscal year 2022 amounted to a whopping $8 trillion. $8 trillion just on our foreign wars. More than half of the extra $15 trillion in debt. Now let's just think about those wars for a second that constitute the bulk of this increased debt. We had a war in Afghanistan that lasted 20 years. It killed thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Afghans. And by the time the United States left, what had been accomplished? Absolutely nothing. The minute the United States left, the Taliban marched right back into power as though we were back in 2001 and as though nothing had happened. I suppose Iraq is different in the sense it's no longer ruled by Saddam Hussein. But to put it mildly, it's nowhere near the kind of Jeffersonian democracy we were promised, let alone one that would spread democracy throughout the Middle East. In fact, the two main effects of the invasion of Iraq was, number one, that it strengthened Iran by empowering the Shiites who were their allies inside Iraq, and number two, destabilized that region and gave rise to ISIS. Even Tony Blair admits that it did that. And then you have all the other bombing campaigns and changes of government in Yemen and Libya, where the change of government in Libya, the NATO war that President Obama promised would not be a regime change war, and yet clearly from the start was designed to get rid of Gaddafi, caused anarchy and slavery and ISIS and a huge migrant crisis in Europe as a result of our destruction of Libya from the air. So it would be one thing if you had a mountain of benefits that you could point to from this extraordinary amount of war spending, trillions and trillions of dollars, $15 trillion in debt from the last 20 years of war. There is no benefit. There are none. There's just cost. There's just harms. Just like there is from the war in Ukraine, where the war faces, according to Joe Biden, the greatest danger of nuclear annihilation since at any point since 1962. And what is the United States, the American people, I mean, not the United States government and the establishment, I mean the American people, which is increasingly different. What are the American people going to get if it's President Zelensky as opposed to some ethnic-speaking Russian leader and separatist who ends up ruling the Donbass or Crimea? What difference does that make in the lives of American citizens, other than the fact they have to hear from the New York Times, speaking on behalf of the establishment, that they need to prepare to lose the few benefits that they have because the United States can no longer afford to provide it to them, because instead, U.S. leaders in both political parties constantly opt for war that does enrich their arms industry donors at the expense of everybody else. Sachs goes on, quote, the other $7 trillion, you have $15 trillion from foreign wars. The other $7 trillion in this excess $23 trillion in debt arose equally from budget deficits caused by the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. America's annual military spending is now around $900 billion, roughly 40% of the world's total. The United States is roughly 5% of the world population. 5% of the world population are Americans. And yet, if you take all the military spending in the world, 40% of that comes from one country, the United States. And it's greater than the next 10 countries combined. U.S. military spending in 2022 was triple that of China, a country that is not settled in the kind of debt the United States is. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the military outlays for 2024 to 2033 will be a staggering $10.3 trillion on current baseline. A quarter or more of that could be avoided by ending America's wars of choice. A quarter of that could be avoided by ending America's wars of choice. Closing down many of America's 800 or so military bases around the world and negotiating new arms control agreements with China and Russia. The United States has $800 billion, 800 military bases around the world, many of which are militarily encircling China. Do you know how many military bases China has outside of China? Depending on how you count, either one or two. 1.5 is how RFK Jr. calls it, describes it. So it's one or two. That is the choice that the United States government and the establishment wings of both political parties have been making at the expense of all American citizens. And yet when the New York Times goes to tell people, get ready to lose your Social Security, Medicare, or have it severely cut, even though you're barely surviving on that right now, as you enter your golden years after spending your entire life working, they don't even mention this because this is what the establishment never wants people to understand. And that's where the money is really going. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.